Sergeant William Torres, riding in the lead vehicle, raised his fist suddenly, signaling the convoy to halt. The young soldier from Texas had spotted something unusual, a massive weathered barn standing alone in a clearing, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. What caught his attention was not the structure itself, but the faint wisps of smoke rising from a gap in the roof and the unmistakable sound of children's voices carrying across the morning air. "Captain, you hearing that?" Torres whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his M1 Garand rifle. The sound was incongruous with everything they had encountered in this devastated region, a sound of life where only death had reigned for months. Mitchell nodded grimly, ordering his men to approach with caution. The possibility of a trap was ever present. Retreating German forces had left behind booby traps and snipers in their wake, and the SS remained fanatically committed, even as their empire crumbled. The squad of 12 soldiers fanned out, moving through the overgrown grass with practiced efficiency. Private Robert Chen, a medic from San Francisco, stayed close to Mitchell, his aid bag bouncing against his hip. As they drew nearer, the sounds grew louder and more distinct, not just voices but crying, coughing, and what might have been singing. Mitchell's heart began to pound. Intelligence reports had mentioned nothing about civilians in this sector, which had supposedly been evacuated months ago. When they were 20 yards from the barn's main entrance, Mitchell called out in his rudimentary German, "We are American soldiers. Come out with your hands visible." The sounds inside immediately ceased, replaced by a terrifying silence. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the barn door creaked open, and a figure emerged that made every soldier's breath catch in his throat. She was a woman, impossibly thin, wearing what had once been a nurse's uniform now reduced to filthy rags. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken but burning with desperate intensity. She couldn't have been more than 25, though malnutrition and exhaustion made age impossible to determine. In heavily accented English, she spoke words that would echo through history. "Please, you must help. 200 children. No food for 3 days. Many sick. Please." Captain Mitchell felt his legs momentarily refuse to obey him as the woman's words registered. 200 children. The number seemed impossible, absurd even, yet the raw desperation in her voice carried the weight of terrible truth. He exchanged glances with Sergeant Torres, whose hand had involuntarily loosened its grip on his rifle. Without waiting for permission, the woman, who would later identify herself as Sister Maria Holzer, a Catholic nun from Munich, turned and hurried back into the barn's shadowy interior, beckoning frantically for them to follow. The smell hit them first, even before their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through gaps in the wooden walls. It was the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, sickness, and something else, the sweet, sickly odor of infection and approaching death. Private Chen immediately covered his nose with his handkerchief, though his medical training quickly overrode his revulsion. As Mitchell's eyes adapted to the gloom, the scene before him materialized like something from a medieval painting of damnation. They were everywhere. Children of all ages, from infants to teenagers, crowded into every available space within the cavernous barn. Some lay on thin layers of rotting straw, others huddled together for warmth, despite the mild spring temperature. Their faces were hollow, cheekbones protruding sharply, eyes too large in shrunken skulls. Many wore nothing but rags or thin nightclothes, entirely inadequate for the cold nights that still gripped Bavaria in early spring. The silence that had initially greeted the soldiers gave way to a chorus of whimpers, coughs, and the occasional weak cry of a baby. Sister Maria moved among them with practiced efficiency, gesturing to different groups as she spoke in rapid, broken English. "These are from the Children's Hospital in Nuremberg, evacuated when the bombing came, but the trucks, they never came back. These others, from the orphanage in Würzburg, their matron died from typhus 2 weeks ago. And these," she pointed to a group of particularly skeletal children in the far corner, "from the camps, Jews, Romani, political prisoners' children. We hide them when the SS came looking." According to documentation later published in the New York Times on May 8, 1945, this barn near the village of Klosterreichenbach had become an unofficial refuge for displaced children as the Nazi regime collapsed. Sister Maria and 2 other nuns, both of whom had succumbed to illness in the preceding weeks, had gathered these children from various sources, united only by their abandonment in the chaos of Germany's final defeat. Mitchell's military training reasserted itself. Torres, Radio Battalion Headquarters immediately. We need medical supplies, food, transport trucks, and every medic they can spare. Chen, start triage. Identify the most critical cases. Everyone else, start getting these kids outside into the fresh air and sunlight. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. And for God's sake, be gentle. They've been through hell. The soldiers, hardened men who had killed enemy combatants without hesitation just days earlier, moved with unexpected tenderness. Sergeant Torres lifted a small girl, perhaps 4 years old, who weighed no more than a bag of flour. Her arms instinctively wrapped around his neck, and he felt her tears soaking into his uniform collar. Private Daniel O'Brien from Boston discovered a group of 6 siblings huddled together, the oldest boy, maybe 13, positioned protectively over the younger ones. When O'Brien approached, the boy's eyes filled with terror, and he began begging in German. Bitte, nicht die Kleinen. Nehmen Sie mich, aber nicht die Kleinen. Please, not the little ones. Take me, but not the little ones. O'Brien, who had lost his own brother at Normandy, felt something break inside him. No, son, he said softly, though the boy couldn't understand his words. No one's taking anybody. We're here to help. You're safe now. He held out a chocolate bar from his rations, and the gesture, so simple, so human, seemed to bridge the chasm of language and fear. The boy's defensive posture slowly collapsed, and he began to weep uncontrollably. Within 40 minutes of Captain Mitchell's urgent radio transmission, the quiet countryside erupted into organized chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Peterson, commanding officer of the division's rear echelon, mobilized every available resource without waiting for approval from higher command. 3 ambulances, 2 supply trucks loaded with rations, and a field hospital unit descended upon the barn, transforming the surrounding area into an impromptu medical facility. By noon on that April day, what had been a scene of quiet suffering had become a hive of purposeful activity. Major Sarah Whitmore, chief nurse of the 14th Armored Division's Medical Corps, took one look at the children and immediately established a systematic approach. The daughter of a prominent Philadelphia surgeon, Whitmore had volunteered for overseas service against her family's wishes and had spent the past year treating everything from battlefield injuries to the survivors of concentration camps. Yet even her extensive experience hadn't fully prepared her for this particular challenge. We need to separate them by condition, she announced crisply, her southern accent becoming more pronounced under stress, as it always did when she was deeply affected. Critical cases to the ambulances immediately. Respiratory distress, high fever, signs of infection. Moderate malnutrition and illness to the middle group. Walking wounded and stable cases to the third group. And somebody find me clean water, soap, and every blanket in the division. The triage process revealed the full scope of the tragedy. Of the 207 children ultimately counted, Sister Maria's estimate had been remarkably accurate. 32 required immediate hospitalization. 47 showed signs of tuberculosis, pneumonia, or other serious respiratory infections. Nearly all exhibited severe malnutrition, with many displaying the distended bellies and stick-thin limbs characteristic of prolonged starvation. 15 were infants under 2 years old, several of whom hadn't eaten properly in days. Private Chen worked alongside Major Whitmore, his medical training proving invaluable. He discovered a 7-year-old boy named Klaus Weber, whose left leg had been badly broken, likely weeks earlier, and had healed at a grotesque angle without proper medical attention. The child had been crawling rather than walking, and the constant pain had reduced him to a ghost of himself. This needs to be rebroken and set properly, Chen reported grimly. He'll be crippled for life otherwise. The soldiers, meanwhile, had transformed from warriors into caretakers. Corporal Michael Romano, a tough-as-nails infantry veteran from Brooklyn, who had earned a Bronze Star at the Battle of the Bulge, sat on the ground surrounded by 6 small children, patiently spooning reconstituted milk into their mouths. The contrast between Romano's scarred, calloused hands and the delicate faces of the children created an image that Army photographer Sergeant Thomas Lee captured on film, a photograph that would later appear in Life magazine and become one of the most iconic images of the war's aftermath. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Sister Maria finally allowed herself to rest, collapsing onto a wooden crate as the adrenaline that had sustained her for 3 days finally ebbed. Captain Mitchell sat beside her, offering his canteen. Through a combination of broken English, German, and gestures, she told him the full story. The children had come from at least 17 different sources across Bavaria and Thuringia. Some were legitimate orphans, their parents killed in bombing raids or combat. Others had been separated from families during evacuations and simply lost in the chaos. A significant number, perhaps 30 or 40, were children from Nazi institutional programs, including the infamous Lebensborn project, which had kidnapped children from occupied territories to be Germanized. And then there were the others, the ones Sister Maria had risked her life to hide. Jewish children, Romani children, children of executed resistance fighters. "I am nurse before I am nun," she explained, her English improving as exhaustion loosened her tongue. "I work at hospital in Munich until 1943. I see what they do to children who are not perfect, not German enough. I cannot watch anymore. So I leave, and I start to take children. First just a few, then more and more. Other nuns help, but—" Her voice trailed off, and Mitchell didn't press for details about what had happened to her companions. According to historical records referenced in The Aftermath: Allied Care for Displaced Children by historian Margaret Anderson, Sister Maria Holzer represented one of thousands of ordinary Germans who had resisted Nazi policies in small, dangerous ways. As evening approached on that April 15th, the operation to evacuate and treat the children hit its first major obstacle. Brigadier General Thomas Keller, the divisional commander, arrived at the barn site in a staff car, his face set in the stern expression that had earned him the nickname Iron Tom among his troops. Captain Mitchell, who had been coordinating the evacuation, felt his stomach drop as the general stepped out and surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. "Captain Mitchell, explain to me why you've commandeered 3 ambulances, 2 supply trucks, and a field hospital unit without proper authorization," Keller demanded, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We have wounded American soldiers waiting for those resources. This division is still in active operations." Mitchell stood at attention, acutely aware that his career might end in the next few minutes. "Sir, the situation required immediate action. 200 children, sir. Many critically ill. I made a judgment call that the humanitarian need outweighed protocol concerns." His voice remained steady, but inwardly he was preparing for the consequences of his unauthorized orders. Major Whitmore, who had been treating a child with pneumonia, set down her stethoscope and walked over, her boots squelching in the mud. Without saluting, medical officers in the field often dispensed with such formalities, she addressed the general directly. "General Keller, I've sent 14 children to the field hospital at Ansbach. Without immediate intervention, they would have died tonight. 5 more won't make it through the week regardless. These aren't just displaced persons. They're dying children." The general's expression didn't soften, but Mitchell noticed a subtle shift in his posture. Keller had a reputation as a by-the-book officer, but he also had 3 children of his own back in Virginia. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze sweeping across the scene. Soldiers gently bathing children in improvised tubs made from ammunition crates, medics carefully bandaging infected wounds, a 19-year-old private named Jimmy Walsh from Ohio reading to a group of children from a German picture book he'd found in the barn, his halting pronunciation making them giggle despite their misery. "How many total?" Keller finally asked, his tone neutral. 207, sir," Mitchell replied. "Ranging from 6 months to 16 years, 18 different nationalities represented, best we can tell. German, Polish, French, Dutch, Czech, even 2 Russian children. The ones with concentration camp tattoos." He paused, his jaw tightening. "We're estimating around 30 of those." Keller removed his helmet and ran a hand through his graying hair. The decision he was about to make would technically violate standing orders about resource allocation. The division was stretched thin, and every medical asset had been designated for military casualties. But orders had been written before anyone had anticipated a situation quite like this. Sometimes, Mitchell had learned during his months of combat, doing the right thing meant ignoring the rules. "All right," Keller said finally. "You've already committed the resources, so we'll see it through. But Mitchell, you're going to have to justify this to Corps Command, and they're not going to be happy. Whitmore, I want a full medical assessment of every child by 0800 hours tomorrow. And someone find out who's responsible for this situation in the first place. There has to be a German agency or official who abandoned these children." As the general departed, Mitchell felt the tension drain from his shoulders, replaced immediately by the weight of new responsibilities. The truth, which would gradually emerge over the following days, was that responsibility for the children's abandonment was diffuse and complicated. The Reich's infrastructure had completely collapsed by early April. Officials had fled, records had been destroyed, and in the chaos of defeat, no one had maintained accountability for the most vulnerable. Sister Maria, overhearing Keller's question about responsibility, spoke up with bitter clarity. "No one is responsible because everyone is responsible. The nurses at hospital in Nuremberg put children on trucks and promise to follow, but they never come. The matrons at orphanages die or run away. The SS officers who knew about the hidden Jewish children, they disappear when Americans come close. And the families who maybe could take some children, they are too afraid, too hungry, too broken themselves." As darkness fell, the soldiers set up perimeter lights powered by portable generators. The barn, which had been a tomb of despair that morning, now glowed with warm light and buzzed with activity. Army cooks had arrived with field kitchens and were preparing vast quantities of diluted soup. Anything richer would sicken the starving children further. Corporal Romano had organized the healthier children into small groups, teaching them a simple game with rocks and sticks that transcended language barriers. 3 days after the initial discovery, on April 18, 1945, the story of the children in the barn reached the outside world through the most unexpected channel. War correspondent Margaret Thorne, a veteran journalist for the Associated Press who had covered everything from the Blitz to the invasion of Italy, had been embedded with the 14th Armored Division to document the final collapse of Nazi Germany. She had arrived at the barn site expecting to write about routine occupation duties and instead found herself witnessing something that would define her career. Thorne, a 41-year-old native of Chicago who had fought her way into overseas assignments through sheer determination and talent, immediately recognized the significance of what was happening. She spent 2 full days interviewing soldiers, medical personnel, Sister Maria, and, most importantly, the children themselves, working through translators to piece together their individual stories. Her dispatch, filed on the evening of April 19th and published the following morning in newspapers across the United States, carried a headline that captured American attention. "GIs become guardian angels. 200 abandoned children, rescued from death in Bavarian barn." Thorne's article, later referenced in Reporting the Peace American Journalism in Post-War Europe by historian David Chen, didn't shy away from the brutal realities. She described 7-year-old Hannah Fisher, a Jewish child from Berlin whose parents had been deported to Auschwitz, found nearly catatonic from trauma and malnutrition. She wrote about twins Jan and Josef Novak, Czech boys whose father had been executed for resistance activities and who had survived by stealing food from German army stores. She detailed the medical crisis, the makeshift solutions, and, most powerfully, the transformation she had witnessed in the hardened combat soldiers who had become surrogate fathers to children who spoke languages they didn't understand. "Yesterday I watched Sergeant William Torres, who killed 3 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat at the Remagen Bridge, spend 2 hours rocking a Polish infant to sleep," Thorne wrote. "I saw Private Daniel O'Brien, who survived the frozen hell of Bastogne, weep openly as he bandaged the feet of a 12-year-old girl who had walked 30 miles barefoot. These men, forged into warriors by necessity, have rediscovered their humanity in the eyes of children who had every reason to fear soldiers and instead found protectors." The article's publication created an immediate sensation. Within 48 hours, the Associated Press office in New York was flooded with inquiries from other newspapers, radio networks, and even Hollywood studios. Donations began pouring into relief organizations, with letters specifically requesting that funds be directed to the children from the Bavarian barn. Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady and already a prominent humanitarian advocate, mentioned the story in her syndicated newspaper column My Day, writing, "These children represent all children caught in war's machinery, that American soldiers, having just defeated a terrible enemy, can show such compassion gives me hope for the peace to come." But the publicity brought complications. On April 22nd, just 1 week after the initial discovery, Captain Mitchell received orders to report to divisional headquarters for a meeting with visiting officials from UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The international organization, established in 1943 to assist refugees and displaced persons, was now tasked with managing the enormous humanitarian crisis unfolding across liberated Europe. Their representatives, led by a formidable British administrator named Colonel Evelyn Patterson, had very specific ideas about how displaced children should be handled. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Patterson began, spreading maps and documents across the conference table, "while we appreciate the immediate humanitarian response, this situation must now be transferred to proper civilian authority. UNRWA has established displaced persons camps with trained personnel. These children need to be processed, documented, and placed in appropriate facilities where we can work to reunite them with surviving family members or arrange appropriate adoptions." Mitchell, who had spent the past week watching soldiers bond with specific children, felt his jaw tighten. "With all due respect, Colonel, these children have been traumatized. They're just beginning to trust the soldiers who've been caring for them. Moving them again to another institutional setting with strangers could be psychologically devastating." Patterson's expression softened slightly. She was not unsympathetic. She had spent 2 years managing refugee situations in North Africa and Italy, but she operated within systematic frameworks. "Captain, you and your men have done admirable work, but you're soldiers, not childcare specialists. You'll be redeployed soon, and then what happens? These children need long-term solutions, not temporary military charity." The meeting stretched on for 3 hours, growing increasingly tense. Major Whitmore argued from a medical perspective, noting that several children were still too ill to be moved. Sister Maria, who had been invited to provide information, made an impassioned plea in halting English about the children's fragile emotional states. But ultimately, military authority would defer to civilian agencies, and Patterson had the backing of both UNRWA and the Allied command structure. A compromise was eventually reached. The children would remain under military care for another 2 weeks, while UNRWA prepared appropriate facilities. During those 2 weeks, something remarkable happened that would influence policies for displaced children throughout post-war Europe. What began as temporary military care evolved into something deeper, more personal, and ultimately more effective than any institutional program could have achieved. The soldiers of the 14th Armored Division, awaiting new orders in the relative quiet of occupation duty, became not just caretakers, but genuine guardians to the children they had rescued. Sergeant Torres proved to have an unexpected gift for connecting with traumatized children. Despite speaking no German, Polish, or any of the other languages represented among the children, he developed a system of communication through drawings, gestures, and simple games. He spent hours each day with a group of particularly damaged children, concentration camp survivors who flinched at sudden movements and hoarded food under their bedding, slowly coaxing them back toward something resembling normalcy. By late April, these same children who had initially cowered from human contact were laughing at his exaggerated pantomimes and competing for his attention. Private Chen, the medic, essentially moved into the barn, sleeping there most nights to monitor the sickest children. He developed special relationships with the youngest ones, the babies and toddlers, who required the most intensive care. A particular breakthrough came with an 18-month-old girl the soldiers had nicknamed Sunny, because no one knew her real name. She had been found with no identification and was too young to tell them herself. Sunny had been failing to thrive, refusing food, and lying listlessly in her crib. Chen spent 3 days patiently feeding her with an eyedropper, singing to her, songs from his own Chinese-American childhood mixed with American lullabies, until she finally began to respond. The day she smiled for the first time, grown men wept. Corporal Romano, the Brooklyn tough guy, revealed an unexpected talent for teaching. He organized the older children into informal classes, teaching them English words through games and songs. Using salvaged chalkboards from a destroyed school nearby, he created lessons that were part education, part play therapy. "Today we learn, thank you, please, and friend," he announced one morning, his Brooklyn accent mangling the German pronunciation as he tried to explain in their language. The children giggled at his mistakes, which was precisely his intention. Laughter, he had discovered, was therapeutic. As word of the situation spread through military channels, soldiers from other units began visiting during their off-duty hours, bringing supplies, toys salvaged from abandoned houses, and most importantly, their time and attention. A young lieutenant from Texas named Bobby Crawford brought his guitar and discovered that music needed no translation. His evening concerts became legendary, with children and soldiers alike singing along to simplified versions of American folk songs. When he taught them, "You Are My Sunshine," the barn rang with discordant but enthusiastic voices in half a dozen languages. According to Margaret Thorne, who had remained embedded with the unit and continued filing stories, this spontaneous system of care was achieving results that surprised even the medical professionals. In her May 2nd dispatch, she wrote, "Major Whitmore informed me today that recovery rates among the children exceed all expectations." While she credits improved nutrition and medical treatment, she also notes that the personal attention, the individual relationships formed with specific soldiers, may be equally important to healing. These children aren't numbers in a displaced persons camp. They're Klaus and Hannah and little Sonny, each known by name, each cared for by men who've chosen to see them as individuals rather than problems to be processed. But the approaching deadline for transfer to UNRWA facilities cast a shadow over these successes. On May 5, 1945, 2 days before Germany's unconditional surrender would officially end the war in Europe, Colonel Patterson returned for a final inspection before the scheduled transfer. What she found challenged every assumption she had brought to the situation. The barn had been transformed. Soldiers had repaired the roof, installed proper windows, and partitioned the interior into separate sleeping areas for different age groups. They had built furniture from salvaged lumber, cribs for infants, bunk beds for older children, tables and benches for meals and lessons. The walls were covered with children's drawings, mostly scenes of American soldiers depicted as impossibly tall heroes. A makeshift playground outside featured swings made from rope and truck tires, a slide constructed from a piece of corrugated metal, and a sandbox filled with dirt from a nearby riverbank. More significantly, Patterson observed the interactions. She watched a 16-year-old German boy named Friedrich, who had been found half dead from infected wounds, now helping Private O'Brien repair a broken chair, the two communicating through gestures and the handful of words they had taught each other. She saw Torres teaching a group of children to play baseball, with a stick and a ball of wrapped rags, their shouts of excitement echoing across the field. She noticed that Sister Maria, who had been gaunt and exhausted just 3 weeks earlier, now moved with renewed energy, coordinating with the soldiers in what had become a remarkably efficient partnership. Colonel Patterson requested a private meeting with Captain Mitchell, Major Whitmore, and Sister Maria in a hastily cleared office space in the barn's converted loft. The British administrator sat down heavily, removing her cap and setting it on the rough wooden table between them. For a long moment she said nothing, her fingers drumming thoughtfully against the worn surface. "I've managed displaced persons operations in 3 countries," she began slowly, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. By every standard metric, what you've accomplished here shouldn't work. You're soldiers, not trained social workers. This facility isn't properly equipped. You have no systematic tracking system, minimal paperwork, and you're violating at least a dozen protocols for institutional childcare." She paused, and a slight smile crossed her usually stern face. "And yet, it's working better than any properly administered facility I've visited." Mitchell exchanged glances with Whitmore, uncertain where Patterson was heading. The colonel continued, "I've reviewed Major Whitmore's medical reports. Recovery rates are extraordinary. Weight gain, reduced illness, improved psychological states, all documented and beyond dispute. But more than that, I've watched these children. They're not displaying the institutional behaviors we see in displaced persons camps. They're not withdrawn, not exhibiting the learned helplessness that comes from being processed as nameless victims. They know their caregivers. They trust them. That's worth more than any amount of paperwork. Sister Maria leaned forward, her eyes bright with hope. You will let them stay? It's not that simple, Patterson replied, pulling out a thick folder of documents. UNRWA has regulations, chain of command, accountability requirements. I can't simply hand over responsibility for 200 children to an army unit that might be redeployed at any moment. But, she emphasized the word, I can propose an alternative arrangement. What Patterson outlined over the next hour would become a model for displaced children's care throughout occupied Germany. She proposed establishing the barn as an official UNRWA facility, but with the current soldiers remaining as primary caregivers under civilian administrative oversight. UNRWA would provide funding, supplies, and specialized staff, teachers, social workers, psychologists, while the military would supply security, logistical support, and the personal care relationships already established. The soldiers would be temporarily reassigned from their combat unit to this specific duty, creating legal authority for their continued involvement. It's unprecedented, Patterson admitted, and I'll have to fight my own bureaucracy to approve it. But I believe it's the right thing to do. These children have already been uprooted, traumatized, and abandoned multiple times. We owe them stability, continuity, and the personal connections they've finally begun to trust. The plan faced immediate resistance from multiple directions. General Keller, informed of the proposal, exploded. You want me to turn combat soldiers into permanent nursemaids? Captain, we have occupation duties, security operations, and eventual redeployment to prepare for. I need these men for military missions, not running an orphanage. But when Mitchell quietly informed him that Sergeant Torres had already put in a formal request to stay with the children, followed by similar requests from 13 other soldiers, Keller's resistance softened. He had seen the transformation in his men, combat veterans finding purpose and redemption in caring for children, and recognized that this mission might be as important as any they had undertaken. From UNRWA headquarters in London, Patterson faced equally fierce pushback. A bureaucratic storm erupted over her proposal to blur the lines between military and civilian authority, with senior administrators warning about dangerous precedents and organizational chaos. The matter escalated to UNRWA Director General Herbert Lehman, former governor of New York, who found himself mediating between rigid institutional protocols and pragmatic humanitarian necessity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On May 10, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender, General Dwight Eisenhower visited the barn as part of a tour of occupied territory. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower had been receiving reports about the displaced persons crisis and wanted to see conditions firsthand. Margaret Thorne, still documenting the story, captured the moment when Eisenhower crouched down to speak with 8-year-old Klaus Weber, the boy with the badly healed broken leg. Through a translator, Klaus told Eisenhower how Private Chen had rebroken and reset his leg, enduring weeks of painful treatment. It hurt very much, Klaus said solemnly. But Private Chen, he cry with me. He hold my hand every day. He say I will walk again, and now I do. Klaus demonstrated, walking in a still awkward but functional gait. Eisenhower, deeply moved, spent 2 hours touring the facility and meeting children and soldiers alike. That evening, according to records maintained in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, the general sent a directive to his staff. The work being done at the Bavarian Children's Facility represents the best of American values. Find a way to make this arrangement official and permanent. These soldiers have earned the right to continue their mission. By June 1, 1945, the Bavarian Children's Center, as it had been officially designated, had evolved into something unprecedented in post-war relief efforts. Colonel Patterson had secured UNRWA funding and official recognition, while General Keller had approved the permanent reassignment of 23 soldiers from the 14th Armored Division to serve as core staff. The facility now operated under a hybrid structure that combined military efficiency with humanitarian mission, creating a model that would be studied and replicated across occupied Europe. Captain Mitchell, promoted to major and designated as military liaison, oversaw the expansion of facilities and the integration of civilian specialists. UNRWA sent Dr. Elizabeth Brandt, a German Jewish psychologist who had fled to Britain in 1938, to assess the children's psychological needs and train staff in trauma-informed care. Dr. Brandt, whose own family had perished in the Holocaust, brought both professional expertise and deep personal understanding to her work. "What you have created here by instinct and compassion," she told the assembled soldiers during her first staff meeting, "is actually a sophisticated therapeutic approach. You've provided what psychology calls attachment figures, consistent, caring adults that children can depend on. This is precisely what traumatized children need most, yet it's what institutional care almost never provides. You've achieved accidentally what decades of child psychology research tells us to do intentionally." Dr. Brandt implemented a structured program that built on the existing relationships while adding professional therapeutic interventions. Each child was assigned a primary caregiver, usually the soldier they had naturally bonded with, who would be responsible for their overall well-being. Additional specialists would provide medical care, education, and therapy, but the core relationship remained between child and caregiver. This approach, revolutionary for its time, acknowledged what the soldiers had intuited. Children need love and consistency more than they need perfect systems. The children themselves began showing remarkable progress. Hannah Fisher, the 7-year-old Jewish girl who had been nearly catatonic, started speaking again under the gentle care of Private O'Brien. Her first words in months were in English. "More, please," requesting a second helping of porridge. Within weeks, she was chattering in a mixture of German and English, following O'Brien everywhere and calling him Mean Danny. The concentration camp survivors, who had initially hoarded food and refused to sleep without keeping watch, gradually began to trust that meals would come regularly and that the soldiers protecting them wouldn't disappear in the night. Sister Maria, officially appointed as civilian director of the center, coordinated between military and UNRWA personnel with remarkable diplomatic skill. She had expanded her mission from simple survival to comprehensive care, organizing educational programs, religious services for multiple faiths, and even recreational activities. On Sunday mornings, children could attend Catholic Mass, Protestant services, or Jewish Shabbat gatherings, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable under Nazi rule and was still unusual in post-war Germany. The educational program, headed by Corporal Romano and 3 newly arrived teachers from UNRWA, faced unique challenges. The children spoke at least 12 different languages, had wildly varying educational backgrounds, from completely illiterate to academically advanced, and many had learned to hide their abilities as a survival strategy under Nazi persecution. Romano's solution was elegantly simple: start with play. He organized activities that taught academic concepts without feeling like formal education. Measuring ingredients for recipes taught mathematics, growing a vegetable garden introduced biology, writing letters to pen pals in America developed literacy skills. As summer arrived, bringing warm weather and longer days, the center established new routines and traditions. Morning assemblies brought all the children and staff together, starting each day with songs in multiple languages and announcements delivered by children themselves, building their confidence and leadership skills. Evening story time, conducted simultaneously in German, Polish, and English by different volunteers, became a beloved ritual. And Sunday afternoons were reserved for family time, when each caregiver spent exclusive time with their assigned children, doing whatever activities they enjoyed together. Margaret Thorne continued documenting the center's evolution, and her articles had sparked a remarkable response from the American public. Donations flooded in: clothes, toys, books, medical supplies, and money. More significantly, letters arrived by the hundreds from American families offering to adopt children or become pen pals. The most touching came from veterans who had returned home, expressing their wish to help. One letter, from a former Marine named Robert Patterson in Oregon, read, "I spent 3 years fighting in the Pacific. I killed men I never met because someone told me they were the enemy. Now I want to do something good with the rest of my life. Can I help these children who had no choice in any of this?" But the question of adoption and permanent placement loomed increasingly large. By mid-June, Dr. Brandt and Sister Maria had completed detailed case files on all 207 children. The findings were sobering. Only 43 had any realistic prospect of family reunification. Parents, grandparents, or other relatives had been located for these lucky few, though even these cases were complicated by destroyed homes, economic devastation, and in some instances, family members who were themselves too traumatized or impoverished to care for children. The remaining 164 children faced an uncertain future. Some were Jewish children whose entire families had been murdered in the Holocaust. Others were children of executed resistance fighters, political prisoners, or forced laborers who had died in Nazi camps. Still others were German children whose parents had been killed in bombing raids or combat, with no surviving relatives willing or able to take them. And then there were the children whose identities remained mysteries, like little Sonny, the toddler Private Chen had nurtured back to health, who still couldn't tell anyone who she was or where she came from. On June 22, 1945, the center held its first official adoption hearing. The case involved 5-year-old Anna Kowalski, a Polish girl whose parents had died in the Warsaw Uprising. An aunt in Chicago, who had immigrated to America before the war, had located Anna through Red Cross channels and petitioned to adopt her. The hearing took place in the Barnes converted office, with American military legal officers, UNRWA representatives, and Polish government-in-exile officials all participating. Anna, clutching the hand of Sergeant Torres, who had been her primary caregiver for 2 months, looked terrified as the adults discussed her fate in languages she couldn't understand. Finally, Torres knelt beside her, and through a translator, explained that her aunt wanted to take her to America, to a safe home where she would be loved and cared for. Anna's response cut through all the bureaucratic complexity. "But I want to stay with you, Sergeant Torres. You are my family now." The hearing room fell silent. Torres, the tough combat veteran from Texas, felt his composure crumble. "Anna, sweetheart, I would keep you forever if I could. But your aunt, she's your real family. She loves you, and she can give you a real home, not just a barn in Germany. You'll go to school, have your own room, make friends. It's going to be wonderful, I promise." "Will you come visit me?" Anna asked, her eyes welling with tears. Torres looked helplessly at Major Mitchell, who nodded slightly. "I'll try, sweetheart, and I'll write you letters all the time. Every week, okay? And you can write back and tell me about America and school and all your adventures." The adoption was approved, and Anna departed for America 2 weeks later. Torres accompanied her to the airport in Frankfurt, carrying her small bag of belongings and holding her hand until the final moment. As she boarded the military transport that would begin her journey to Chicago, she turned back and called out, "Don't forget to write, Sergeant Torres. Every week." "Every week," he promised, his voice breaking. "I swear it." The scene with Anna's departure repeated itself, with variations dozens of times throughout the summer and fall of 1945. Each adoption or family reunification was simultaneously a victory and a heartbreak. Success in finding these children permanent homes, pain in severing bonds that had been forged in crisis and hardship. The soldiers who had become surrogate fathers discovered that loving children meant eventually letting them go. A lesson that came with profound emotional cost. Private Chen's separation from little Sonny proved particularly difficult. After months of intensive care, the toddler had finally been identified through dental records as Sophie Bergmann, daughter of a German engineer and his French wife, both killed in an air raid on Dresden. A maternal grandmother in Lyon had been located, a widow in her 60s, who desperately wanted her only grandchild. When the grandmother arrived at the center in September, Chen spent 3 days helping Sophie transition, teaching the grandmother the songs and routines that comforted the child, showing her how Sophie liked to be held when she was sleepy, explaining which foods she would eat and which she refused. The day of departure, Chen held Sophie one last time, memorizing the weight of her in his arms, the way her small hand patted his cheek, her habit of humming tunelessly when she was content. "Be good for your grandma," he whispered in English, though Sophie understood only a few words. "Be happy, grow big and strong, and maybe someday you'll remember the soldier who loved you when you needed him most." According to documentation preserved in the National Archives, and referenced in historian David Chen's The Aftermath. By January 1946, 137 of the original 207 children had been placed with family members or approved adoptive parents. The remaining 70 required ongoing care, either because no suitable placement could be found or because they were still too medically or psychologically fragile for transfer. The Bavarian Children's Center continued operating until December 1947, eventually caring for over 400 children as new displaced persons were discovered throughout occupied Germany. The hybrid military-civilian model proved so successful that UNRWA established 12 similar facilities across Europe, each one staffed partially by military personnel who had volunteered to work with displaced children. The concept of trauma-informed care, personalized attention, and attachment-focused caregiving that had emerged accidentally from the soldiers' instincts became formal policy in displaced persons operations. Major Mitchell, who remained with the center until its closure, never returned to teaching in Pennsylvania. Instead, he joined UNICEF when it was founded in December 1946, dedicating the remainder of his career to child welfare programs around the world. In a 1978 interview, shortly before his retirement, he reflected on those days in Bavaria. "We went to Germany as warriors, prepared to destroy an enemy. What we found instead was an opportunity to build something, to heal rather than harm. Those children saved us as much as we saved them. They reminded us why we fought, not for hatred of Germans, but for love of humanity, for the belief that children deserve to grow up safe and free." Sergeant Torres kept his promise to Anna, writing her every week for 3 years until she told him, in increasingly confident English, that she was happy with her new family and he didn't need to write so often. He did anyway, less frequently but consistently, maintaining contact through her teenage years, her wedding in 1961, and the births of her own children. When Torres died in 1987, Anna, now Anna Patterson, a schoolteacher in Seattle, traveled to Texas for his funeral, bringing her 3 grown children to meet the man who had saved their mother's life. Private O'Brien adopted a German war orphan himself in 1948, a boy named Friedrich who had lost his entire family. Friedrich grew up in Boston, became an engineer, and had 5 children of his own. In family gatherings, he would tell his children and grandchildren about the American soldier who had found him starving in a barn, and taught him that not all soldiers brought death, that some brought hope instead. Dr. Brandt's psychological studies of the children, published in professional journals between 1947 and 1952, revolutionized understanding of childhood trauma and recovery. Her research demonstrated that strong attachment to caring adults, even when formed after severe trauma, could significantly improve outcomes. These findings influenced child welfare policies for decades and contributed to the modern understanding of resilience in traumatized populations. Sister Maria Holzer continued her work with displaced children until her death in 1971. She never spoke extensively about her own heroism, the fact that she had risked execution by hiding Jewish children from the SS, but focused instead on the children themselves and the soldiers who had helped them. In her private papers, donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum after her death, she wrote, "People ask me about courage, about risking my life for children. But I saw more courage in those American soldiers who chose to love children who were, technically, the enemy's offspring. They could have walked away, followed orders, maintained professional distance. Instead, they opened their hearts. That is the truest courage, to choose love when hatred would be easier." Margaret Thorne won a Pulitzer Prize in 1946 for her coverage of the Bavarian children and other displaced person stories. In her acceptance speech, she reflected on what she had witnessed. "I've covered wars, natural disasters, and human suffering across 3 continents. But the story that restored my faith in humanity was watching soldiers become fathers, watching hatred transform into love, watching the victims of history's worst atrocities learn to trust again. That barn in Bavaria became a cathedral of human decency, a testament to what ordinary people can accomplish when they choose compassion over convenience." The barn itself, the original site where 207 children were found that April morning in 1945, was preserved as a memorial. The German government, in cooperation with UNICEF and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, renovated it in 1993, creating the Bavarian Children's Memorial and Museum. Visitors can walk through recreated living spaces, read the children's stories, and see photographs of soldiers and children together, images that capture moments of pure human connection, transcending the boundaries of nation, language, and history. On the memorial wall, 207 names are inscribed, every child who was rescued that day. Below the names, a plaque bears a quote from Captain James Mitchell. "We found them abandoned by war, forgotten by the world, left to die in obscurity. What we did was simply what any decent human being would do. We saw children who needed help, and we helped them." History will remember armies and generals, victories and defeats. Let it also remember that in the midst of humanity's darkest hour, ordinary soldiers chose to be fathers when children needed fathers, chose to be healers when the world needed healing. The story of the Bavarian barn rippled outward, influencing not just post-war policy, but the broader understanding of humanitarian responsibility. It demonstrated that institutional care, however well-intentioned, cannot replace human connection. It proved that even in war's aftermath, even between former enemies, bonds of compassion can form that transcend political divisions. And it showed that healing from trauma requires not just material resources, but the presence of caring individuals who choose to see victims as humans deserving of love, not problems requiring processing. Today, social workers, psychologists, and child welfare professionals study the Bavarian Children's Center as an early example of attachment-based care for traumatized children. The hybrid model of professional support, combined with consistent, loving caregivers, has been adapted in refugee camps, orphanages, and foster care systems worldwide. The letters between soldiers and their adopted children, preserved in archives, provide moving testimony to relationships that lasted lifetimes, built on the foundation of those desperate days when children needed saving, and soldiers chose to become saviors. The last survivor among the original 207 children, a woman named Helena Kowalczyk, gave an interview on her 80th birthday in 2015. Asked what she remembered most clearly about the barn and the soldiers, she said, "I remember Sergeant Torres teaching us to play baseball with a stick and rags. I remember Major Whitmore singing while she changed bandages. I remember Private Chen rocking babies and crying when they cried. But most of all, I remember the moment I understood that I would live, that someone cared whether I lived or died. That moment changed everything. Those soldiers gave us more than food and shelter. They gave us back our humanity, our ability to trust, our permission to hope. That is the greatest gift one human can give another." The Bavarian barn stands today as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, individual acts of compassion can light the way forward. 207 children were saved not by grand political gestures or elaborate humanitarian programs, but by soldiers who saw suffering and chose to alleviate it, who encountered children and chose to love them, who had every reason to walk away and instead decided to stay. Their legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in the lives of children who grew up, raised families, and taught their own children the lesson they had learned in that barn. That in a world capable of terrible cruelty, ordinary people possess the power to create extraordinary kindness. The children of the Bavarian barn scattered across the world, to America, Canada, Australia, Israel, throughout Europe, but they carried with them a common memory. The morning American soldiers arrived at an abandoned barn and, instead of seeing enemy casualties or bureaucratic problems, saw children who needed help. And they helped. That simple act of human decency, repeated 207 times in individual relationships between specific soldiers and specific children, proved more powerful than all the hatred and ideology that had nearly destroyed them. It remains, 70 years later, a story that shocks not because of its horror, but because of its humanity. A reminder that even in war's aftermath, even across the deepest divides, the capacity for compassion endures.